And I would like to say that I'm here as a scientist, but also as a mom. I lived in San Diego for over 30 years, and my kids were born here, and they now went through the college. And so the issues of education or hydration, I also lived through that as a mom. So, how do we change slides? Do I do it, or do I ask someone to help me? Thank you, Dan. So I would like to tell you a little bit more about dehydration and a little bit about Gaia Medical Institute, because we are a small institute, and so it would be good to introduce us and then tell you about what we developed to help people better understand hydration and dehydration, which is the rapid saliva-based dehydration test. And then actually I very much look forward to getting feedback from you how actually monitoring hydration in kids could help them to achieve better hydration and hopefully help with lowering the risk of obesity. Next slide, please. So first, who are we? Well, we are a team of scientists and doctors working closely with certain universities, including UCSD, and our goal is to advance preventative medicine through developing rapid saliva tests for health monitoring and for disease diagnostics. The idea being that if people are to care about preventative medicine, they need tools which are non-invasive, simple to use, and low cost, because then they will be willing to test themselves instead of going to hospital when it's too late. We are located in La Jolla, very close to UCSD. Next slide, please. So here is a little bit about what we are working on. I will tell you more about hydration, which is actually closely linked with human performance and resilience, really understand on a molecular level the molecular physiology of health. On that, we work closely with the US Army, because interestingly, NIH has not been historically that interested in health, but the US Army through their Force Health is. Then we also work on the topic of concussion. We develop rapid saliva tests for detecting acute concussion and also post-concussive disorder. So we are really excited about that to really bring it to the field from hospital. We also just got awarded another NIH grant for following phase 2 research on monitoring HIV/AIDS for detecting both acute, but mostly what we brought to the table is therapeutic monitoring instead of blood tests. And we also do some work with VA on heart failure. Next slide, please. So now about dehydration. So first, it's good to pause and reflect that most of our body is really made of water. So water is really very important. Next slide. It's important really across our health. First of all, it's an essential nutrient. It's most of our body. And it plays central role in many processes, from our cells, which would not work without proper water balance, to transporting nutrients, oxygen, and also various signaling molecules like hormones or antibodies to maintain our immunity, to circulate our blood and lymph, and also to remove the waste, and to regulate our heat, and also, not to forget, to play a role in how our joints and how our spine works. So it's obviously very important chemical. And this sort of approach to distinguish between mild dehydration, which is like if a 100-kilogram person would lose 2 kilograms in water. And it is called mild, but it's somewhat a misnomer because that can already have adverse impact on health. And moderate is losing more body weight in water. Both of those can be simply prevented or treated by just drinking water. Whereas severe dehydration is severe health threat and people have to go to ER. Next slide, please. Dehydration is a very common problem. Basically, everyone is at some point at risk of dehydration, but some populations are more at risk. Most of them actually children. And the second group are seniors. Both children and seniors, because of their biology, how much of their body actually is water, and also that they don't have total control over fluid intake, and they may have bigger fluid losses, they are at the highest risk. And then there are many other populations. I would like to point out we have the soldiers and firefighters, an example of occupational risk. But in Southern California, it's also good to add that there are a lot of people who work in the fields and they are at high risk. Next slide. So why do we actually care about dehydration besides knowing that it's good to be hydrated? Well, because even mild dehydration causes physical and cognitive deficits. And if you look actually on the list, that those are subtle things, and yet that's why the Army actually selected our company as the best technology to develop for them rapid dehydration tests for the field, because even totally healthy young men and women in the Army, when they are dehydrated, they lose their capacity to work and make good decisions. And so then the complications, it's certainly great risk of heat injury or also cold injury, because in like in Alaska bases, people lose water very rapidly. And then there's also complications when their mental capacity goes down. There are many more accidents. So also Air Force pilots can just crash a plane. And then there are injuries, including actually concussions and infections. Falls affect senior people who are dehydrated. And then there is a chronic really complication or disease risk. And that's where the obesity and linked to diabetes and also chronic kidney disease is actually to be listed. So actually there are many reasons why to care about good hydration. So how do we now actually know that someone is dehydrated? Well, it's actually very costly and inconvenient to find out. People have to go to emergency department, and then they are checked by a physician. They get physical exam, their history is taken, and if there is suspicion of dehydration based on the physical signs and history, they are right away treated. So they get IV. And meanwhile, their blood and urine, if they can produce urine, is sent to a lab, and clinical lab tests done, which will then confirm they had or didn't have dehydration. So as you can see, the cost is doubled right there, because you have really no way how to decide outside of hospital. So the trip to ER comes with a price tag. Then the treatment is given to people who are not necessarily dehydrated. And so that really causes a lot of clogging of ERs. And so besides what I mentioned, the cost and inconvenience, it's also that the physical signs are unreliable. So the presentation is actually not good guide, and current studies say in seniors, it's just really, they are not reliable. And the blood test actually cannot detect mild dehydration. And so people are misdiagnosed and sent home. They are not, well, either they are treated or it just looks like there's no problem. And they go home and they do have problems. So there is an unmet need. And it is to have some rapid and simple and low-cost test, which would make possible routine hydration monitoring outside of hospital, either at home or point care or just point of need, if we call it like that. Next slide. So that inspired our search for developing such technology. And as I mentioned, actually the Army independently realized they would like to have such technology. They searched around and they selected us as being the best technology. What we proposed to them is what you see illustrated there. So something on the line of pregnancy test or ovulation test. So proven commercial platform, but utilized for saliva and measuring in saliva so-called biomarkers or molecules which provide signature of dehydration. The advantage of that kind of technology as compared to going to ER and having the diagnostics there, that it's objective, so it's not just sort of asking, are you thirsty? And it's actionable, because either people are found by that to be hydrated or dehydrated. And the answer is provided rapidly, because the clinical tests take 24 hours, 8 to 24 hours. So this is a rapid answer. The sample is not a large blood draw, it's saliva. It's easy to use disposable test. And we are estimating that the test will cost $1 per strip. It has some other advantages. We can detect mild dehydration. I mentioned that the blood test has to wait for moderate, and the test will go through FDA, so it will be shown to be reliable. Our goal really is that in red, and that is not to hook people on test, but to teach them how to improve their hydration skills so that they can actually learn how to stay hydrated. So that's the really main goal of our effort. Next slide. I don't want to really bother you with science, but those who would be interested, we look on many molecules in saliva. We perform clinical study at the Army, UCSD, two-field study with Marines, which I will mention more in detail. We focus on 10 markers in saliva, and then we perform yet another clinical study at UCSD to really nail down what would be the best markers for the test. And we did it in collaboration with another site so that we can cross-confirm results, and we selected these biomarkers. So there's really a lot of solid, unbiased science, rigorous science behind the test. Next slide. I would like to mention that this research has been funded by United States Army, and we also have NIH funding, because we are now taking it towards developing tests validated for seniors. And one of the reasons being here, we'd like to also validate it for kids. So this is then NIH more funded effort. So as I mentioned, we conducted clinical studies. I will not go to detail. If someone is interested, I'd be happy to explain. I just want to mention that in the clinical, you have total control over the experiment. So you can dial in how much they are dehydrated, but IRB will tell you not more than 4%, and they will also dictate relatively mild environmental conditions. So that's why we pushed for doing research with Marines, because we went to Mojave Desert when it was 120 degrees. That's not allowed in the clinic. And these guys were really dehydrated. No IRB would ever permit that. So we wanted to know that our test would stand to really field conditions, chewing tobacco, whatever. Next slide. So I just wanted to just say there's another lesson actually from that. When we approached the commander, he said, oh, sure, come and measure baselines. We have doctrine, everyone has access to water. They, in fact, carry camelbacks. They're all hydrated. And if you run, I actually, again, ran into some doctor of Marines, and he said, everyone is hydrated. Well, when we went there, we found that in Pendleton, actually, nearly 80% of Marines showed up for the training exercise dehydrated, and it was done by urine as gold standard. So they were moderately dehydrated, not mildly. And we conducted interviews, and we found that they were dumping the water. It just was too much to carry. So sometimes some institution may think, being that School of Marines, that they have it done. There are drinking fountains, everyone has access. And people may even say we do drink, but they may not. Next slide. Twice, when we went to 29 Palms in Mojave Desert, they hydrated a little bit better. So only 66% of them were starting dehydrated. But still, basically, the challenge was there was no objective test for the sergeant or squad leader to say, okay, you all hydrate, but if when they show up, there is no way to say who is and is not dehydrated. So as much as it then inspired what could be done for kids, so in the Army, our test will be for squad leaders during basic training to teach skills when young people come to the Army, because papers show young people these days don't hydrate well. So that they learn in that first camp, how does it feel to be dehydrated? How does it feel to be hydrated? And if they still don't do that, then the squad leader can check them an hour before starting, and if someone is dehydrated, they say, sit down and drink 2 quarts of water, so that they just don't start so dehydrated. Next slide. So as I mentioned, our really vision of intended use, both with the Army and also with the seniors, which I've explored in detail, is that not to again hook someone on the test, but to give them a way how to objectively and simply gain personal experience. How does it feel to be hydrated, dehydrated? Thirst comes pretty late. And how to properly hydrate. I'll touch on it that actually rehydration with soft drinks is actually bad. So there needs to be some objective meter how to do it correctly. And so at the end, the users of the test should emerge with improved hydration skills, so that they actually are then in charge of their own preventing their own dehydration, which is either the user or someone who is responsible for them. So being that squad leader or mom and dad or family members for seniors. So as I mentioned, we've wrapped our mind in the public health around how such tests could help seniors to stay hydrated. And we sort of self-testing family members. So what I foresee is that if we would insert such rapid saliva test, and if we could with that improve hydration, that coming back what happens as adverse effect, we could improve physical and mental performance, which would provide potentially educational benefit. And also lower risk of complications, which can range from the accidents to falls and infections, but as this group very much care, also to impact the chronic implications. And instead of going to details on them, I have some papers which I can send to anyone who wants to. I have at the end of the presentation references to them. So there are some mostly current really studies over the last 5 years, which are conducted both in Europe and really United States across the world, which show how actually access to drinking water can actually help with lowering obesity, and how actually rehydrating with sugary drinks is actually exacerbating the kidney injury, which is triggered on molecular level with dehydration. Next slide, please. So what are really the roadblocks between having everyone well hydrated? Well, first I would like to mention, and it's one of the papers in the references, a recent study from last year conducted by CDC and Harvard School of Public Health showed that over half American kids up to the age 19 are actually dehydrated, and that's a lot. That is a big change of opinion, because the original epidemiological studies, which were very scarce, they just speculated that it's probably less than 1% of population. But 50% is a lot, and that study also showed that kids don't drink plain water. And so those are things to take into consideration. And with that, I would add that the Army just released data showing that the new recruits have 5 times higher incidence between 2012 and last year of heat injury and rhabdomyolysis. Those are 2 complications in their environment of being dehydrated. So it's a challenge. People just change their behavior, and that's basically the reality. The other part is the challenge is that the dehydration contributes to obesity. And you know better than me that obesity is a main health challenge. And so anything which can chip into it is good. And then how to rehydrate? So that's another challenge. If the rehydration is done with soda, that's not good. If it is done with plain water, one has to watch out for hyponatremia, which is relatively rare but can happen. That's when people drink so much water, they basically dilute their sodium. But in American diet, there's so much salt in the diet, that's relatively rare. And so there are studies also mentioned in my references that when kids played sports, they got more dehydrated, but then in families or settings where they had eaten a lot of fruit and vegetables and drank water, that they basically rehydrated safely. And there's just one more reason why not to drink soda water, because there are actually 2 molecular pathways which are triggered by the fructose, which is, or other sugars converted into fructose, which directly damages kidneys. So besides already known obesity and diabetes, chronic kidney disease is on the rise. And that's also something we don't want in anyone. Next slide. So here is the list of references. If someone wants to look, they are recent. If someone is interested further, I'd be happy to provide more information. Next slide. So thank you very much for your attention, and I save some time for questions.
for hydration level would be good?
All right, so my idea, which I a little bit discussed, was if the community were interested, we conducted a study with the Marines, which basically changed their knowledge of their own status. And so even though there are publications about that half American kids are dehydrated, that was not done in San Diego, to my knowledge. So if any school or after school setting or anything like that would be interested, we would be happy to conduct for free a study where we would collect, if possible, a little bit urine and saliva, or at least the urine, and from the urine we could give you right off reading what's basically the level of the hydration. So that if some schools, just like the Marines, think like we have fountains on every corner and the kids are told to drink, so we are fine, so we would be happy to bring the reality check and potentially come back in case there would be improvement on it. We don't have the test yet, we are working on it, so when we have it as prototype, we would be interested to work with some site with the test being for free, just basically to test them. And as we will work further with NIH to find out whether they would support the validation in children, I'm basically reaching out to the community that we feel that we can contribute to success of your efforts with obesity by providing more information about hydration. And perhaps if teachers would have such tool, they could better help the kids in their care from preschool onwards to basically learn not just how to read and write, but also how to stay hydrated, which would serve them well.
I know I've mentioned this before, but when I worked at a school, I was always hounding the kids about staying hydrated, about giving them water. One of the reasons why they told me they did not want us to drink was because then that required a bathroom pass. And they had a hard time with the teachers giving them bathroom passes. And so that's another factor that comes in as to why they choose to not hydrate.
Or the bathrooms aren't clean, or they're not stocked, or they're not safe.
Well, no, the bathrooms are clean, stocked, and safe.
In some schools.
But in some schools.
That's right.
But the teachers are, they're questioning why they need to leave the classroom, and maybe the bathrooms are too crowded during passing period, things like that. And so I just wanted to bring that up it's a system-wide change that it would be important then to educate the teachers and the administration about hydration as well.
Thank you for bringing it up. I would like to say this is mirrored with what's in literature and also what I heard on personal level from the senior care, where in San Diego, the senior care workers said that they rather not even ask whether the senior is dehydrated, because then they would have to stay and take him to the bathroom. In literature, it's well documented that seniors have lower fluid intake because they don't want to bother caregivers, or they just basically, it's very hard for them to get to bathroom. And so there is self-imposed dehydration on that spectrum of age too. So you have two sides of life where you depend on someone. And so that needs to be addressed, because you are right, without that, it is certainly a very important factor.
We always talk about how a lot of decisions are data-driven, so I could see how if a study like this were done at a particular school, that would be local data that shows, guess what percentage of kids are dehydrated, and these are the potential consequences of that. And then maybe that could create, some of that system-wide change, not just the inputs in, but, what happens afterwards, that they need to be, have a policy on allowing children to go and figure out a way to do it safely. And
I think there is a long road, but if we do it together, then we can do it, of education. Just like until recently, concussion was badge of honor. It's like you play sports, you have concussion. Well, this year was first year when NFL admitted that concussion is bad. Of course it is bad, just like dehydration. But actually it does take the education, because also like with the military forces, there is certain badge of honor too, like, yes, we can withstand dehydration and everything. But it's actually, there's such a gap of really mission readiness and doing better job that actually so far has prevailed over this, like, oh, we can slog through the dehydrated.
I thought of another population that might be interesting to study, and Kim is here in the room. I mean, lactating mothers, it's crucial that they're hydrated. And, you know, they're, to have a quick, easy test, maybe in the hospital, or, you know, at a well baby visit, you know, for the mom, or with lactation advisors, you know, that could be a really interesting population to study and address.
You are quite right. I remember years back when kids sort of grow from the first few weeks, like mother makes more and more milk. It's hard to keep up being hydrated.
And if you're not well hydrated, you're not going to
Right, and so it seems almost not intuitive, but if you have to make 3 liters of milk a day, then it has to come from somewhere.
Well, and most moms would say they get thirsty when they, not every, but many moms get thirsty when they breastfeed. And since thirst is a late indicator, that kind of makes me ask the question, you know, how hydrated are they when they sit down to breastfeed? If all of a sudden it's like, oh.
But the rule of thumb is without lactation is that people eat and drink normally and in addition drink 3 liters or 3 quarts of water. Then people are euhydrated. So reflecting on it, I tried. I think I get to 2 liters. But actually one does feel much better if one drinks that many fluids.
On one note, though, if you are overhydrated, that can lower milk supply. So generally, we say, you know, eat to hunger, drink to thirst. So there are adverse effects to being overhydrated.
I think everything has some reasonable level.
Yeah, exactly.
Any other comments or questions?
Susanna?
I have a question. So where can we find more information on proper hydration, maybe for different age groups like this?
Well, with the references I provided, some of the papers address it. Otherwise, it is not that there are books about it.
Okay.
Those are current studies which are comparing various approaches to it. So it is to really look on literature. If you want help with that, email me. I would be happy to direct you. But it's not yet all discovered.
And I have some cards, if anyone would like cards for Dr. Southern, I can pass them out. But I do want to point out a handout that was picked up at the front when you came in, you know, kind of applying what we talked about to our work in schools. And there are some resources.
And make this very